All right, and thank you, Reverend Johnson, for speaking with us today. And we'll be speaking on Easter, a celebration of joy.
And thank you, Beth. I appreciate your being at the helm for this new approach. And it's great to be back, isn't it, together in person, so many of us, and welcome as well to those on Zoom. I just want to amplify something that Phyllis mentioned, and that after the service, I'll be having what I sometimes call an inquiry session for those who are new to us and want to find out more about Unitarian Universalism. Give you an opportunity to get some coffee and some refreshments, and then we'll be meeting in the library here, and I'll call you together at that time. But please join me. It'd be great to get to know you. Several years ago, I delivered an Easter sermon where I spent most of my time in the sermon refuting belief in the bodily resurrection of Jesus. I noted that there were more than 20 discrepancies in the various gospel accounts of the purported event. And I noted that according to Matthew's gospel, at Jesus' death, there was an earthquake and graves opened up outside of Jerusalem and bodies came forth in Jerusalem. They were resurrected. I said, I'm a little bit dubious about that account. It seems like there'd be some other historical reference to it other than in the Gospel of Matthew, if that actually had happened. And then, of course, 40 days later, according to gospel accounts, Jesus rose up into heaven. I said, I just have difficulty accepting all of these events as actually have happened. The important thing is that Jesus' spirit and his message survived his death, and that his disciples moved beyond their fear and guilt to be implacable carriers of his message. And that message continues today, where the poor are attended to, the naked are clothed, the hungry are fed, the homeless are given shelter, and those who are suffering from injustice are ministered to. And I pointed to many of the folks at that time in the 20th century, Mother Teresa, for instance, and Martin Luther King, who had drawn their inspiration from Jesus, and that the immortality of influence that Jesus has had is available to some degree to all of us as we serve our highest principles and values. Well, after the service, a fellow came up to me very upset. He said, I'm just terribly upset by your sermon this morning. I just wonder if there's a place for me in this congregation and for my wife. And I know he was from a Jewish background, and his wife was from a Roman Catholic background, and they were trying to find out if our church was a good fit for them. And we often serve as a good fit for such folks, happily so. So I was formulating my rebuttal. Well, I wasn't talking about the theological Jesus. I was talking about Jesus the Jew, and that many of his teachings, if not all of his teachings, had an analog among others in the Jewish tradition. But then he said to me, and this floored me, he said, well, I happen to believe in the literal resurrection of Jesus from the dead. Is there a place for me here in this congregation? And I assured him there was, because many Unitarian Universalists throughout history have believed in the literal resurrection. He wasn't alone. And my sermon was a means of my sharing my personal ideas and experience, and he was not bound by that. We have freedom of the pulpit and freedom of the pew. and that indeed he was welcome. And I assured him that I had known UUs who believed in immortality of the soul, others even resurrection of the body, some with immortality of influence, many believed in reincarnation. So I said, we don't have a settled doctrine on this, and you certainly are welcome. Well, he and his wife stayed, and they became very active members in the congregation. They established a community-wide interfaith dialogue, which was very, very successful. So I determined then and there, I'm not going to spend the rest of my ministerial career debunking the Easter myth on Easter Sunday, because we have a wide range of attitudes and beliefs towards this event. What I'm going to find is the kernel that unites all of us. And I think that is Easter as a celebration of joy. And I mean that in the dictionary sense of the term, a state of happiness or felicity, of blessedness, a source or a cause of delight. That that's behind, I guess, the Easter story in its essence for me. I think it's important to realize that Jesus was not a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief only. And that's what I grew up with as an evangelical Christian. But if you read the Gospels carefully, he was a party animal, eating and drinking and saying, I'm come that you might have life and have it more abundantly. He just was not living his life in terms of his ultimate sacrifice to satisfy an angry God. So I think that's important for us to realize as a source of joy. But of course, also, Easter as a source of joy calls us to appreciation of nature, coming back, especially in the northern climes, from apparent death. Of course, that's where the word Easter comes from, in honor of the Anglo-Saxon sun goddess, the sun reviving again and bringing back life to earth in new and wonderful ways. Wordsworth, the poet, wrote, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers, and little we see in nature that is ours. And this time of year, really suggests to us that we pay attention and appreciate, as Jesus did, who said, consider the lilies of the field. They toil not, neither do they spin. Yet Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Actually, for many years of my ministries, I've had Easter sunrise services. And at some point, we have silence just at dawn when the birds start their song. Have you ever done that? Just as that starts in the morning. What a glorious thing that is. What a glorious thing that is. Try it sometimes and see if that does not bring you joy. And of course, maybe it's a little different in Florida. And my wife and I are both native Minnesotans, and it was hard to believe in 30 and 40 degree below weather that nature would come back. And of course, often on Easter, it hadn't come back because April in Minnesota can be terribly blizzardy. And Easter sense really didn't come until late May or early June, when I remember my first congregation going out into the church cemetery behind the church and looking out at the fields as the corn crop was coming up and all the leaves were out, and saying, this is really an Easter moment for a Minnesotan. And even Easter in Florida sometimes is different. Of course, we don't have the renewal of nature in the same way. And I was mentioning this to my Stewart congregation a couple years back in Florida, where I was feeling sad on Easter. I said, Paul, why are you feeling sad? And I realized because so many of our snowbirds had already gone home. And I said to them, how many of you are leaving this next week? And half the congregation raised their hand. And so I said, really, an Easter moment for that congregation was the first and the second Sunday of the new year, when we had the greatest attendance and all the members of our choir were back and we were going full steam. So that was really our Easter moment for the Stewart congregation, the second Sunday in January in Florida. But we've got to realize there are many different Easter moments of joy where we can recognize the flight, as Floridians, of the snowbirds back to Florida. And then, of course, joy arises when we attend to the little things or even the inconsequential things. Attention. Holly Bridge Elliott, in her book, Beholding God in Many Faces, writes, I remember this illumination happening to me one noontime as I stood in the kitchen and watched my kids eat peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. We were having a most unremarkable time on a nondescript day in the midst of the most quotidian of routines. I hadn't censed the tables or sprinkled the placemats with holy water or uttered a sanctifying prayer over the Wonder Bread. I wasn't feeling particularly spiritual, but heeding, I don't know what prompting, I stopped abruptly in mid-bustle or mid-wool gathering and looked around as if I were opening my eyes for the first time. The entire room became luminous and so alive with movement that everything seems suspended yet pulsating for an instant like light waves. Intense joy swelled inside me And my immediate response was gratitude for everything in that space. The shelter of the room became a warm embrace. Water flowing from the tap seemed a miracle. And my children became for a moment not my progeny or my charges or my tasks, but the eternal beings of infinite singularity and complexity, whom I would one day in an age to come apprehend in their splendid fullness. Isn't that a wonderful description of a mystical event of attention? Now, both the Quran and the Talmud claim that on Judgment Day, each of us will be judged adversely for every joy we have refused. And I just love the Buddhist saying, may all sentient beings be well, may they be free from suffering and the root of suffering, and may they know the joy that comes after sorrow. And that brings me to my next point regarding joy, that it comes when we take note of the healing that takes place after our losses. And I mentioned this in reference to Jesus' disciples over time, that they left behind their guilt and their fear and became carriers of his message. But I assert that none of us within the hearing of my voice this morning are entirely unscathed to this point in life. We have experienced losses of loved ones, of jobs, of a body part, of our faith or abilities, losses which are grievous. And thank goodness that a process of healing, a natural process, happens over time and we experience resurrection. And I'm not saying it's foolproof and that it always happens to everyone every time, but it so often does. And isn't that an amazing cause for joy? I've heard President Biden say this many times to people who are grieving. He said, a time will come when a smile will come to your lips before a tear to your eye as you remember loved ones who are gone. Isn't that a wonderful statement? I remember a time where I realized in joy that I was healed of a grief to a certain extent. My mother died in October of 2000, and my brother Philip videotaped her funeral service. And but for several years, I couldn't watch it. I didn't want to relive that grief of that day. It was a difficult experience. And my brother Tim, sister Janice, and I had given tributes, but I just could not bring myself to watch it. But presiding over the service was a minister who had known my mother for 50 years, but he didn't say a thing about my mother. He called us to salvation, almost a virtual altar call. And I was so upset. I never wanted to see that video. But my wife, Carol, and daughter, Kristen said, Dad, let's watch it. So I did. And I was amazed that something had taken place within me, a healing. It was a joyful experience to watch that tape as I heard for the first time what I actually said, what my sister said, my brother Tim said, in reference to the ongoing meaning of my mother's life and our ongoing lives. So a healing and a resurrection had taken place within me in a remarkable way. And most gratifying of all, my brother had deleted the portion that the minister had said. So I didn't have to live through that again. And then I would suggest that joy arises when we take note of the old saying, enjoy yourself, for it may be later than you think. Remember that story about Jesus shortly before his death? A woman, a follower of some sort, came and anointed him with costly perfume and against his death. And his disciples were upset. That money should have been spent to help the poor, not to anoint Jesus. And Jesus is reporting saying something. I wish he hadn't said it quite this way. Remember, he said, you're poor, you'll always have with me, but you're not going to always have me with you. And I said, oh, Jesus, why did you say that? Because that's, of course, been used as the basis for laissez-faire economics and militating against a robust social safety net. I wish he had just said, she's done a wonderful thing. Don't be so picky. Let it go. But she had the joy of giving to him and the joy of his receiving shortly before his death. If she had put it off, it would likely have been too late. It would likely have been too late. And she had that joy. I remember, I think it was the year before last, I had said in a sermon of New Year's resolutions, I'm going to be in contact with a minister who was my mentor and thank him again. And I didn't get around to it until he died. And I never got it done. And how much more joyful I would have felt if I had acted on that intention before it was too late. You know where that term came from? This is a fascinating story. Maybe later than you think. It came into our culture more than 85 years ago from Dr. Frederick Loomis. He was a physician, and one day he was looking through the roster of patients in his hospital, and he came across a woman with the same last name, Loomis. He said, I think I'm going to stop in and say hello to her. And first he checked with her doctor if it would be all right. And her doctor said, well, I don't know if she's going to want to talk to you or have any visitors because she suffered the death of her newborn child yesterday. But he went in and he spent some time with her, showing empathy and comforting her in her loss. And that was it. But 2 days later, he got a letter one day from this woman. And she wrote, you may not remember me, but I'm the woman who you visited 2 years ago when I was in the hospital. I was so sorrowful, so down, and your visit meant so much to me. And I want to thank you for that. But I thought of you today, she wrote, because I'm in Beijing, China, and I was invited out to a beautiful Chinese home. And while we were having lunch in the garden, I noticed a plaque up on the wall and asked for it to be translated. And the words were, enjoy yourself, it's later than you think. I thought of my circumstance. I've been putting off having another child because I'm still grieving, but I determined then and there that I would do so, Providence cooperating, and have another child. But then I thought of you. On that day you were in my hospital room, you were so weary, so weighed down, so tired. The nurses told me later that you spend almost all your waking hours with your patients. I thought of you when I saw that translated phrase, and I trust that you will take some time to enjoy yourself, or it may be later than you think. The next day he went to his office and said, I haven't taken a vacation in years. I'm going to go off on a long desired trip to South Africa. And he called his friend Shorty and said, will you go with me? He said, well, I'm trying to close a business deal. And he told him about it maybe later than you think. He said, okay, I've been working with those people for 4 months. They can hold off a little bit. And they went and they had a wonderful time. And a number of years later, Shorty was dying and Dr. Loomis was visiting him. He said, wasn't it wonderful that we took that time to enjoy ourselves? Paradoxically, it's at the most, it's the most joyous when we realize that it is not going to last forever, this life. Enjoy yourself. The Egyptians had a myth that at death, a person would be confronted by the god Osiris, who would ask them 42 questions about their life. And the final one was, did you find joy? Did you help others find joy? If this question was answered affirmatively, the person would move on to a wonderful afterlife. But if answered negatively, the person would be fed to a hippopotamus. So it behooves us, Egyptian or otherwise, to find joy, to help others find joy in the here and now. And then I think joy comes when we open up ourselves to humor. And I hadn't known this till I read this a while back, but in the Christian tradition, it was a day where people went wild in church, in Mass. They had been kept things under wraps during Lent and gone through the sadness of Good Friday. And so Easter was a time to celebrate jokes and quips, even particularly the days after Easter too. Sometimes things which bordered on sacrilegious. During the Mass, the priest might throw colored eggs to the boys' choir in the balcony and receive a deluge of them back. This was because a great joke had been played on the devil. The devil had thought he had won when Jesus was crucified and dead and buried, but God raised him up and broke the power of the devil. What a joke. What a joke. Well, next Sunday, I'm going to follow up with a sermon on humor. I think we all need it, right? For what we've been through. But one story comes to mind. It's not a gloriously happy or a joke, a raucous joke, but I just find it so clever and interesting. And it comes from the Second Vatican Council. Pope John the 23rd could never keep straight two of the American churchmen, Cardinal Cushing and Cardinal Spellman. He got their names mixed up time after time. And about the umpteenth time, he apologized to Cardinal Cushing for getting his name wrong and promised that he would do better in the future. Cardinal Cushing said these words, "Oh, that's all right, Holy Father. No one's infallible." Isn't that a great Easter joke? No, as I close my sermon, I would phrase the question that often has occurred to me. Is joy something that happens to us, or is it something we may consciously cultivate? I remember years ago reading the autobiography Surprised by Joy by the Christian apologist and Oxford and Cambridge professor C.S. Lewis, who claimed that joy can never be induced or made to happen. It has to be a surprise to you. It's a matter of grace. It's given to you from beyond. Well, that's the case in some cases. You know, that story about the woman in the kitchen with her children, that was kind of a divine surprise to her. But I like what William Kuyken says. He says, joy, like attention, befriending, and compassion, is an intention, cultivation, and practice. Often neglected, joy is both a capacity we have and a capacity that can be trained and developed. It is a primary component of psychological well-being, encompassing moments of appreciation, enduring contentment, and a sense of confidence and gratitude. It takes only a small step of mindful wholeheartedness to enjoy a piece of music. Notice the stars in the sky, the sunlight glistening on the leaves, the people we love around us, a good meal, or all that is right in our bodies in any given moment. You take joy if you're feeling a good measure of health in your body. You know, Thich Nhat Hanh said, when we have a toothache, we center our attention on that toothache. How about when our body is doing well? Do we take time and attention to experience joy? So much of what I said this morning is summed up very well by Frederick May Elliott, who had been president of the American Unitarian Association for 20 years before his death in 1958. And I came across this in one of his writings, which I share with you in closing. He wrote, "When I go to church on Easter, I expect to be reminded of the elemental truth that in this universe of ours, with all its hesitancies and timidities and tragedies, the tides of life are flowing fresh, manifold, and free. I expect to find myself swept into participation in the universal chant of praise for the irresistible, shining glory of the great gift of life, which for a brief moment, I have the privilege of sharing." That, my friends, is a celebration of joy. May it be that for you on this special day. Amen.